Good day and welcome to Sundaram Mutual's Voicecast on the E.M.I, Economy, Markets and Investments. This is the July edition, and today we'll be focusing on the part one, which is the economy wrap. So basically, we spoke about the fact that the COVID crisis is very different from the global financial crisis that the world experienced 10 years ago. And in the slide, I've basically highlighted the key parts which are different. So first is that this is a supply crisis, whereas the earlier one was a demand. Second, there's an immense degree of clarity about the source of the problem, being clearly a medical problem. Third, that the speed and size of response were very different from the GFC. And the fourth is that there was a lot of coordinated action as compared to very uncoordinated response to the GFC. The key element that will keep coming through today's webinar, as it did in the last time, is that we are looking forward to a V-shaped recovery from this crisis as opposed to the U that we experience. Reasons for that would be that this is a supply side problem. That's number one. Number two is that this time the infection containment through lockdowns has been a success, as I will show you later. So as the containment narrows and narrows, more and more of the world can come back. So that's another reason for a V-shaped recovery expectation. The third is, of course, as constantly research scientists across the world are putting their might behind discovering a vaccine or a cure. In about a year's time, when that comes through, the world should be able to quickly come back to normal. What exactly has been the impact of the COVID crisis, as we saw last time? What I'd like to just focus here is that in every sector, there are companies which are positively affected and negatively affected by COVID. But if you see at the top end is more the demand side, where you can see a lot more companies on the right, that is a positive side, whereas at the bottom, which is the supply side, you see a lot more negatively impacted. So reinforcing our thought process of it being a supply side crisis, right? So the response to the world was basically to start off with the monetary stimulus, because that's what they did even in the global financial crisis. So as you can see here, the top 4 countries of the world, which is the G4, explained in terms of those color codes. And you can see at the right, see the sharp jump in the monetary stimulus as compared to the left-hand side of your graph, which shows you the 2008 response. So clearly the monetary response has been way, way, way above that during the GFC. The same in terms of numbers, if you look at it, right? In just 2 months, there's been $2.5 trillion from the Fed and 65 billion euro. And during the course of the year, they expect about $13 trillion of money to be pumped into the world from the central bankers, right? So effectively, you're expecting the bank balance sheets to expand by about 28% on the base. Massive amount of stimulus. Stimulus gives you easy money, but you also need cheap money, which is what rate cuts achieve. And again, if you look at the cut, it's gone right down to below 1%, 0.6%. But again, you look, this time we're giving you in the graph the 2008 number. So today, the rate cut has taken the overall monetary policy rate well below that in the GFC. So this comparison with the GFC to reinforce the V-shaped thought process will keep coming through in today's webinar also, right? So let's move from the central bankers to the governments, which give what is known as the fiscal stimulus, right? So here again, a comparison with the GFC tells you that against 1.5% of GDP that was used as a fiscal stimulus, this time we're using close to 4%. That's number one. So the size of the response. The second aspect here is to look at where it was spent. And as I highlighted in my earlier webinar, the job retention schemes and the business loans and grants and unemployment insurance together are all supply side impact. So even the governments have been clearly targeting this as a supply side problem, right? And one of the things which they've done in addition on the supply side is to use corporate loan guarantees. As you can see, a range of countries have used a lot of the fiscal stimulus in the form of loan guarantees. What is the impact on the fiscal deficit? However, despite the loan guarantees which are off balance sheet and don't affect fiscal deficits, across the world, including our country, which we'll come to in detail later, you're seeing that there is a wide expansion in the fiscal deficit. And to look at it, the top 4 countries plus China, they're going to expand it to 13.4% of GDP compared to 10% in the GFC. As you go down, you can see that this is despite them 40% of the package is a supply side impact on the thing. So this summarizes the world's response. And so in addition to the fiscal and the monetary response, you've got to tackle the core of the problem, which is essentially a medical problem. And as I briefly mentioned, they've used the lockdown as the way to contain the infection. And this gives you from week 1 to week 17, right? As you can see, in the middle, they were all at red, which means very severe lockdowns, but all have started easing towards the yellows, right? This is first top 15 countries and another 15 countries. So across the world, lockdown has been long, intense, but as you can see, it's been lightening, which means that the lockdowns have been by and large successful, and the focus of the governments has sharply shifted to easing the mobility restrictions and resuming economic activities. So in all of this, then are the green shoots visible? Because when you talk about V-shape, you should get a clue of it well before it happens. So first, let's look at driving trends, because as I said, mobility restrictions have been removed. So this is the Apple Mobility Trends report. As you can see, across the developed market, after dropping to a sharp low in the last quarter of March, right, and the first week of April, you're seeing a sharp rise in the mobility trends, that is driving requests. So clearly an indication of a V-shaped behavior. Right. Next, restaurant bookings. We're looking at the demand side because restaurant bookings completely flattened out in the lockdown. Again, can you see as soon as they have released the restrictions, restaurant bookings have shot up. Right. Next, look at the consumer sentiment. So this is the University of Michigan conducts a consumer sentiment across various geographic regions of the US. And as you can see, across wherever it had dropped, it has again started to do a V-shaped recovery. Moving to the supply side, to manufacturing. You can see the sharp V-shaped difference that's happening in the ISM, that is the manufacturing index, whether it's in Philadelphia or New York State, both are showing a V-shaped recovery, right? And then let's move outside the US to look at Europe and Germany, which is the truck home, right? BMW trucks and Benz trucks are all from Germany. Germany, large lorry distance travel, which is a freight indicator, is again showing a recovery levels here, right? So as a result of this, what do we expect at this moment? The impact of the COVID crisis on the world GDP. So the first thing is, prior to the crisis, the world, as you can see, the blue graphs is showing, was 2018 onwards, the world GDP was declining, and then there was an expectation of a rise. So what COVID has done, that rise has been pushed back by nearly a year. So effectively, COVID's impact is expected to last a whole year. So in that context, the World Bank came out with their expectations of GDP growth this year and next year for all the countries in the world. The first line alone you can focus, which is the world output, which for 2020, as you can see, is expected to be negative 4.9%, but the very next year, you are seeing that they are expecting a 5.4 positive. So clearly, you can see that the World Bank is also expecting a V kind of shape. So what is the anchor behind the expectation of a V-shaped recovery? Again, using the global financial crisis, right? When you look at it there, the US real personal consumption expenditure, which is again showing a bottoming, and the unemployment rate. These two rates, you see, what if you read the lines below, right? Consumption in the last crisis recorded well ahead of employment pickup. So as the employment picks up, the consumption. So in the US, the higher incomes account for a larger share of consumption, and lower income households are taken care of through the stimulus measures. So that's an anchor behind expectation of V-shape. Another anchor is the extent of household debt. So this time, thanks to the lockdown, people have not been spending. So they have been saving and they have been borrowing less. So as you can see, during the global financial crisis, the borrowing was at 97% of GDP. Today, it's at 74%. So there is enough room for people to go and borrow to augment a V-shaped recovery. So these are anchoring thoughts behind why a V-shaped recovery is very possible. And the third, from a manufacturing supply side, is what I call the Baltic Dry Index. And that's a freight index. It's a trade-related index. So what it does is that when you book a ship to send out some goods, you have to book it well in advance. So future rates of ship bookings give you a sense is economic recovery coming back. It's a trade indicator. So if you look at it here, December 31 in this last row, the way the Baltic Dry Index was actually at 1090. When the COVID crisis hit, it dropped to 626, 40% drop. Now, within 3 months, to July 6, it's gone up back to 1900. So can you clearly see that in December itself, the world was expecting a slowdown. All the freight indicators were negative, slightly improved, and then look at the sharp green, that whether it's a 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year, there's been a sharp V-shaped bounce back in the trade index. So clearly evidence of a V-shaped recovery on the anvil, and this gives you what is the expectation. So the line in the middle, the world, the black line, it gives you the world growth, which as you saw from the World Bank slide, is expected at 5.4% for next year. So which is the area which is going to go the fastest? China. Why? We will come to that a little later. But China is where the disease hit first, and their disease where it normalized first. So from that perspective, if you look at it, China is going to lead the world's recovery, right? Naturally, the developed advanced countries will be slower in the recovery process, but all other emerging countries are expected to be just shy of the world average. So the order of pecking order is China, other emerging world, and advanced countries in terms of the V-shaped recovery. So now I talked about the China. Why the markets are trying to track the Chinese recovery? Because China got the disease first and came out of it first. So can you see here the PMI, the Purchase Managers Index, excellent lead indicator of the economy. So manufacturing, non-manufacturing, and non-manufacturing services, all the three have already posted in the month of March itself a V-shaped recovery. Next is the various trackers there: cement shipment, heavy truck sales, smartphone sales, right? Hotel occupancy, whole bunch of trackers, if we see, are all on a strong recovery path. So China leads the world, and this is the Chinese service industry. So if you see here, the operating capacity versus normal in the first set of table, in the next one is the demand versus normal. So the date of normalization, if you see, are varying from May right up to June, August for operating capacity, and right up to fourth quarter. So this Chinese recovery is going to be a lead indicator of the world recovery. As you can see here, when I put the Chinese PMI, that indicated to you that the US and the Eurozone PMI followed thereafter. So from a world perspective, close eyes on the Chinese recovery to see how soon the recovery will follow in other parts of the world. So the developing story is of a world trending towards a V-shaped recovery in GDP. That sets the world economic piece at best, right? So now we move on to a focus on our country, India. Now in India, the problem with the Indian economy, while the world economy, I said, was expecting a recovery, right? Indian economy, the problem was we were already in a slowdown pre-COVID, right? As this graph of GDP growth components will tell you, except for government expenditure, which is the green graph right on top, green line, whether it is private consumption, government capital formation, or private capital, all of them were in a downturn. And this, what is the impact of this slowdown? This impact of the slowdown is that last quarter was further hurt by the coronavirus crisis, right? So as a result, if you say last quarter numbers came 1% below expectation, revising the whole year's GDP growth. And not only that, the government also went and revised the whole of last year's prior reported GDP growth. So whole year GDP growth came down sharply to 4.2%, right? One good point here about rewriting the past data down is that the base for the future becomes better. So what India has done effectively is to say that the past was actually much worse than we thought it was. The future will not look as bad in comparison. Just a small thought to bear in mind as we go forward, right? So as a result of this, what we were expecting a 3.3 GDP when we put the budget last year actually has ended up with a 4.6% GDP. Why do I say this? Because any ability for fiscal stimulus will put the fiscal deficit under strain. Already, we have been 1.3% more than what we expected. So naturally, who worries about the fiscal deficit? The rating agencies. Why is rating important? It's important for foreign capital to come in, both into our stock markets, debt markets, and into the permanent capital, which is called FDI. From that perspective, right, this has limited India's stimulus response. So government still announced a 21 lakh crore stimulus. But genuinely, if a 21 lakh crore spending were to take place, our fiscal deficit would be taken to 16.7% of the GDP. Clearly not welcome and not possible, because India would have been straight away downgraded. So clearly the government could not spend the 21 lakh crore. That was the headline announcement. So what did they have to do? They've announced this, but they had to resort to a series of jugards to keep the fiscal deficit under bay. So the first jugard they did was, they, in this 21 lakh crore, they just quietly added the Reserve Bank's liquidity stimulus of 8 lakh crores. So the genuine was 21 minus 8, only 13 lakh crores. And hence, what was considered 21 lakh crore as 10.5% of our 200 lakh crore GDP actually turned only to 6.5% of real fiscal stimulus. Right? So let's, for a minute, having mentioned the RBI's monetary stimulus, look at what the RBI actually did. So the first the RBI did was to release 8 lakh crores as fiscal as a monetary stimulus, of which if you see here, 50,000 crores was for mutual funds and 50,000 crores was for PFIs, right? So roughly it means that if you take away the other stuff, about 6 crores was a banking related fiscal stimulus, sorry, monetary stimulus. So here when you see this graph, the green line tells you that they also added a rate cut. Just as international central banks and monetary policy, they did liquidity pumping and they did rate cut. RBI also has done rate cut, and the liquidity pumping that they did, you can see in the light blue shade here, it's about 6 lakh. As I mentioned, some money was diverted to mutual funds and PFIs. So this is the sum total of what the monetary stimulus was. Coming back to our fiscal deficit, so like I said, this was 10.5% GDP. But if you look at it in terms of the right-hand side, this tells you that the fiscal measures are actually only 13 lakh crore, 13 trillion, 1 trillion is 1 lakh crore, 6.5% of GDP, right? And after that, in June, they announced another 1.4 lakh crore through migrants, for the migrants who came back. They extended the food subsidy till November this year, right? Now, how do they manage this? As you can see in the table on the right-hand side at the bottom, that the fiscal impact of this whole package was only at 0.8% of GDP. 10.5% stimulus, but only 0.8% fiscal deficit impact. What did they do? Like I said, they did a series of jugards. So what is the next jugard they responded? They used guarantees. If you recollect in the world case, I showed you that they used guarantees. So those guarantees were used by the Indian government too, in the sense of 2.2% of GDP, 4.5 lakh crore, was used in the way of guarantees. What do the guarantees do? They're off balance sheet, so they don't affect fiscal deficit this year. When do they affect fiscal deficit? If and when a borrower defaults and the guarantee is called upon, that year it will come into the fiscal deficit. More importantly, this was meant to do two things, right? Wherever there's a credit freeze, where banks are scared to lend, they're taking a risk-off approach, on where those sectors are critical for the economy from a multiplier effect, right? Those two I have highlighted in blue here. So that, for example, that's how they have used this. So first is, I've listed out from the Atmanirbhar program what all they did here. Second is that they increased job guarantees and state incentives. Third is that they unclogged liquidity for the MSMEs. That is medium and small and medium enterprises, which are a key part of the capital multiplier, the employment generator for the economy, but where banks were developing cold feet on lending. So they unclogged liquidity for MSMEs here. Then look at the number of steps for MSMEs that they announced here, listed out in this table. I will not go through them. I'll leave it here for a second for you to go through. The next one is again that what do? They gave guarantees for liquidity to NBFCs, who also in turn helped the MSMEs with their lending. They gave refunds to MSMEs within 45 days. They simplified the MSME definition. They disallowed global tenders under 2 billion rupees only for MSCs and other companies to bid for them. So this way, they are trying to do a lot for the capital multiplier, employment multiplier part of the economy. Right? Some more on that line in this line, the slide that I'm showing, right? That was the second jugad. Another jugad number 3 was what? That they raised 1.73 lakh crores through excise duty on crude. So this is where the gods came to their aid, because in this worldwide recession, crude price went from $80 down to $30, which meant that even with a 20% drop in petrol demand because of lockdown and everything, still the government could mop up 1.732 lakh crores as income, which was 0.8 to 1%. So this also helped to cushion the fiscal deficit impact. So net, finally, what the government did, in order to meet all of this committed money, they cut the budgets on the capex side by 1.3 lakh crore, and other departments' revenue budgets, they cut it from what they were originally sanctioned and diverted it to the COVID-related situation. So this is how the government managed the situation. So net, after doing all of this jugad, right, you see the right side, I've laid out the math. 10.5, they reduced 4, became 6.5, reduced 2.2 due to guarantees, became 4.3, and then they cut revenue expenditure by 2.9, they cut capital expenditure by 0.6, leaving a 0.7%, and then their revenue increased by 0.9 because of crude hike, leaving a 0.9 plus 0.7, 1.6% additional fiscal deficit. So from 4.6 of last year, we are expected to end the central government at 6.2. right? That's what this is telling you here. In summary, the fiscal deficit situation as things stand today, government is expected, central government, to end with a 6.2 fiscal deficit. However, the states also have been permitted, but they were limited to about 5% through their ways and means advances. So the state plus center fiscal deficit is expected to be 10.5 to 11.5, maybe 12% of GDP this year. This is how the government has managed. And as I said, in a situation where the world itself was expanding its fiscal deficit across the advanced countries, we got away with it from a rating perspective because of that situation. This is a worldwide crisis, right? So we have looked at the fiscal response, we looked at the monetary response. Let's look at the medical response, right? And as I've highlighted here, India went through a long and severe lockdown, right? So the same slide back again. This time, let's look at India. India falls somewhere in the bottom half of the table. You can see that. So we went the only country in the world to go to 10 in terms of the severity, and we stayed there for 4 weeks. So very long and intense, severe lockdown we did. So what is the issue with this? This lockdown caused its own economic damage, but we didn't have a choice because medically we were trying to control it, right? So this gives you, again, tells you that no other country was at 10. Now this gives you a sense of how successful we were medically. This data as of yesterday, right? And if you look at it here, India is today third ranked in the world. So everybody is saying, oh, we are very bad. Not at all. Because if you look at our population, which is 138 crores, we account for 17.7% of the world's population. But if you take, we are only 6% of the world's cases. And our recovery rate is 7%, better than our case rate. So effectively on a death percentage, we are only 3.7% of the world. Look at it in another way, right? If you just go to the blue line in the second row there, proportion of population. The world population is 779 crores. 779 crores, the proportion of the world population affected by coronavirus is 0.15%. Right? Whereas India's proportion of population affected is only 0.05%. So it's only 1/3 of the rate of the world. So clearly, we have to admit that all these numbers, while they take India up in the rankings, actually given our population size, we are very well positioned in terms of having managed this successful medically. But if we had not done, this could have been very worse. That's why the severity and the intensity of the lockdown was very important. I draw your attention just one more country because I brought up that name earlier. Go to the bottom. China started the whole corona crisis. This is today 22nd ranked in terms of number of patients. And look at it. They are absolutely, they have had only 523 active cases as of today. So the success of China is why China is being tracked. While many are accusing them of having actually sent it to the rest of the world, the fact that they managed themselves very, very successfully medically, right? So from that perspective, for India, the trajectory of COVID is key on whether we can see a V-shaped recovery or not. So if you see this trend, right, the cases doubling rate has been going up, which is good news. So this is showing sign flattening with more and more days required to double. In absolute numbers, India has the third highest number of COVID deaths after US and Brazil, as you just saw in that slide. The next thing is the recovery and the death rates. So when we measure again deaths per million, India is only 114th rank in the world. So the medical success of it, I want to reinforce. And on number of deaths per million, we get only 15 deaths per million people, while the US has had 401 deaths per million people, and Brazil has got 306 deaths per million people. So we all deserve a pat on our back to the way we've actually responded, though those rising numbers creates a panic from a television news channel. Really speaking, given our population, we have done a very good job of managing this crisis. Because of that intensity of the lockdown, we've been more successful, and hence the focus of the government has shifted towards easing mobility restrictions and resumption of economic activity. So unlock 1.2 has now been followed unlike 2.0, right? So this is how the mobility restrictions have moved in the country, right? From a nationwide lockdown to partial to step by step, we have reopened the economy, now finally with unlock phase 2. The effect of this is that before we went into this unlock phase, we had only 18% of our country in the red zone, which has a very high proportion of cases. 82% of the country was in orange or in green, with very minimal cases. Why this has significance is the fact that now with the unlock one in place, we are talking about containment zones and non-containment zones. As you can see, by and large, the geographic spread of India, we have protected thanks to our lockdown. the spread of this infectious disease beyond certain containment zones. But bear in mind that the containment zones are in urban India and the rural India is open for business, but our country's GDP is very concentrated in the containment zone. So rural India can recover faster, but urban India will take time, but GDP will also take time. But anything rural related will lead to an earlier recovery. So the government's focus, because what happens is that while this is true of the GDP, the fact is the population is also concentrated in rural India. And now with the migrants going to rural, that's happened even more. So naturally, the government's, whatever stimulus the government has given, the efforts of the government has been towards taking care of the larger population in the rural India. That is also helping the recovery of rural. So let me now look at a great boost to rural India the government did by free food supply, interest subsidy for their mudras, issue loans, a whole bunch of things, Kisan credit card, a lot of things oriented at rural India. Some more boost to rural India, concessional credit, emergency working capital facilities, right? Credit link subsidy for affordable housing, right? Then Agri Infrastructure Fund, 1 lakh crores for that, micro food, fishermen, animal disease control, animal husbandry. So whole set of targeted focus on agriculture, markets, agri-infra was done by the government. In fact, reforms to the Essential Commodities Act, APMC reforms, all of this quality and price assurance to the farmers, all of this is targeted to rural India. So naturally, if you want to see whether India is in a recovery mode and the green shoots, you will see that rural India leads the way. The first is the NREGA household work demanded. Can you see how it has sharply come up? In fact, on a YOY basis, right? If you compare this May over the last May, there's a 40% NREGA job demand which has gone up. What happened? At this particular time, it was very crucial because the Rabi harvest was there and it was time for Kharif sowing. And the monsoon outlook, because monsoon has covered all of India in nearly 12 days in advance, right? With excess rainfall. So you can see that with the migrants going to rural India, adequate supply of labor was also available. Hence, if you see here, sharp Kharif sowing jump, as well as fertilizer sales have jumped 83% to 111 lakh tons. So clearly, rural India is on a good wicket, right? Because there's a 104% jump in Kharif sowing. And naturally, the fertilizer sales graphs shows you the recovery in that. And naturally, because of the sowing and the farmers feeling very good with a good Rabi harvest, tractor sales have turned around from continuous negative for so many months. Finally, tractor sales are at a 17-month high. So clearly, rural economy is on the thing. And vehicle registrations, which are dropping April to 12 and May to 6. In June to date, already 32.7 thousand vehicles have been registered. Now, albeit there will be a lot of two-wheelers here, but the more importantly, this is probably also more from a rural India. As you know, even Maruti or Hero Honda or any of these vehicle manufacturers, the majority of the sales come from rural India. And so again, rural India's recovery is at the fore here. And then we talked about the fact that with the lockdown, there would be a problem with repayments and collection. Moratorium was being extended, but look at this. Muthoot Capital, Shriram City, Mahindra Financial Services, Shriram Transport. All April over May have seen a sharp jump in their collection efficiencies. Evidence of things coming back to normal. Right? And then the e-way bill generation by the government departments. As you can see, the average run rate and everything from a negative, strongly negative, has come to very less negative, and hopefully soon will turn into a positive territory. Tolls collection at highways. Can you see the V-shaped recovery in the toll collection? That clearly indicates truck and car movements. Ads, advertisement, which got badly hit in the lockdown. You see the ad insertions index of Jeffries. Can you see the recovery there in the 7-day moving average? Right. Traffic congestion, people traveling in Delhi, Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, everywhere you can see after the lockdown, there is an improvement in the congestion. Power generation, industrial activity improvement. Look at the sharp, again, the V-shaped recovery in power generation, right? And ultimately, there is a Nomura Business Resumption Index, right? Which was at 77 just prior to the lockdown. It has come back to 69. Yes, it still has to reach the peak of 100, but you can see the recovery process underway. So this Business Resumption Index naturally means that unemployment today, whether it's rural India or urban India, has come back to pre-COVID levels. So I think this is an important statistics that despite the migrants moving over there, they have been re-employed in other businesses, in farming activities, and in government infrastructure activities. So you are seeing it that life is come back to a normal as far as the employment statistics are concerned. And naturally, this business assumption on all is showing itself in terms of a rebound in the manufacturing PMI, which had dropped to way below 30, has now come back to 47. When it crosses 50, it means that we are out of a recessionary model back into a growth model. So one of the evidences of that is that exports are normalizing faster than imports. So in April versus May, April they fell 60%, May they fell only 36%, whereas imports still are declined by 51%. So this normalization means that we are in for a trade surplus this quarter. So as a result of this green shoots and what happening, but the primary impact of the lockdown plus the crisis, what has been the impact of India's GDP? So this is the way GDP forecasts have gone on coming down. Pre-COVID, then pre-lockdown, then 13th April, which was halfway through the lockdown, and then no more recent, the latest. As you can see, we have taken down the V. The downtrend has been further and further accentuated. But end of the day, there's still an expectation of a V-shaped recovery. Right? The World Bank says the same. This is the same slide that I showed a few minutes earlier. Here, let's look at the India there, which is right in the middle. If you can spend a minute to just locate India there, you can see what the World Bank is saying of India, that for the calendar year 2020, they expect India to be negative 4.5%. Yes, we are in a recession, but they are also expecting that the very next year, we will bounce back to 6%, right? This is the World Bank's expectation. Our expectations are anchored around the fact that for the financial year, we believe it should be 4.2 because the recovery would have started. So calendar year may be 4.5, but financial year will be slightly less. But we also have a risk scenario that it could, if there's a resurgence of the crisis and things go bad, then it could even be a 12% negative GDP growth this year. It's a possibility. Probability of that is to be determined, but it's a possibility we have to work it. And when you look at the economic recovery, you've got to look at not just GDP, but the gross value added in the economy. That we believe, as it gradually rises, will take until Diwali for the negative YOY growth to be erased. So we expect a positive GVA growth to happen post Diwali. And from that point of view, let's look at it, what's going to happen to India's fiscal deficit this year. I said 6.2, right? So, but from a futuristic perspective, good news here is that GST collections, which dropped to 32,000 crores, have gone back to 62,000 and to 90,000. So collections are improving, indicating normalcy returning. And good news for our fiscal is that inflation is likely to be stable and not rise, and well below RBI's comfort zone, giving the room to RBI to focus on rate transmission. They're not necessarily going to do another rate cut, but at least they can focus on rate transmission and not worry about a rate hike. Right? So as a result of which, our current account is turned to surplus. Right? I explained, no, exports were dropping lesser than imports and all of that. So because of that, the current account surplus augurs well, so that we expect that the very next year, financial year 22, India's combined fiscal deficit, which can touch 12% this year, state plus center, should come down to a more healthy 8.5%. So we think this V-shaped recovery will help the country to bring down the fiscal deficit even in the very next year, as a result of which we expect to get through this crisis without a meaningful downgrade. I'll leave this here 1 minute for you to read. Right? So while we do not expect a rating downgrade, only Moody's did that to still retain us at investment grade, which turned us to negative outlook. S&P kept us at stable, which is a positive surprise for India. So this we expect India to get through without a meaningful downgrade. However, if the situation turns bad and the government, as I said, announced some more incentives, they announce some more, even if it happens a downgrade, the fact is India's dollar debt, the worst, if you look at it, any downgrade in rating, it's actually a debt rating, right? So we don't expect, because only 2.5% of India's local debt of our RBI's FX reserve, which is $500 billion. So any major impact, we believe, will be negative on local debt from the downgrade, even if that tends to happen. So that's the short-term outlook towards India till next year. What about the medium-term outlook, right? Medium-term outlook is that it's important for us to kickstart the capex cycle. Why is that? Because in order to generate employment for our people and all that, we need things which multiply very well in the economy. Revenue expenditure like Narega declines to half X after 4.5 quarters, but capex persists in their multiplier effect for even 16 quarters. That's 4 years. So I think the importance for our medium-term growth is how quickly we reorient our economy towards favorably spending on capital expenditure. Because as I mentioned in our fiscal deficit situation, government cut capital expenditure by 1.3 lakh crores this year. So why is also important? Because in the rating agency thing, you can see the fiscal roadmap, which I explained to you already, that we are expecting to come back to 8% combined fiscal deficit, but the intent to reform is what the agencies look for. Why? Because as reform happens, then future GDP growth and income of the government through GST and tax will improve and bring the fiscal deficit under control. So that intent to reform is very important. The government in the Atmanirbhar program took care of that by easing through. They didn't waste the crisis, and they actually brought in a lot of reforms, which, if you have now read through this, is actually a lot of difficult reforms, less likely and high impact. So this graph is top and bottom is low impact, high impact. Left and right is less likely, more likely. So clearly the key tough part of it is the top left, which is what we thought as less likely, but which has a great impact on India. Those reforms have been the ones that the government has pushed through in this difficult time. I think the rating agencies were very much aware of this situation, and they did not lose sight of that fact. I think that's a critical piece to remember. And the government's actions on this front are seen in the electronic exports and imports, where we shifted a lot of our mobile phone manufacturing to India. So imports came down and exports also went up. Got hurt by the COVID. The government then announced a $6.7 billion plan to boost electronics, and that should help India to produce 10 lakh crores. So again, a medium-term positive reform-oriented gesture. Right? But the problem is what? The problem is that we don't have the money. Our fiscal deficit already in distress. Therefore, FDI and FII flows into the right sectors are critical. The government did a lot in the budget to make FII flows in the infrastructure sector. They gave 100% waiver for the interest, dividend, and capital gains. They gave a lot of DDT removal, which helped for the money to come in to FII flows. FDI flows have always been continuously on a rising trend for India, as you can see from this table. Right, last 4-5 years, you've got upwards of $60 billion of FDI. Right. Next is that this FDI share, even in a situation like this, we have been rising as a percentage of world FDI. Today, we have reached 3.3% of world FDI flows, but this is not enough. It needs to take a quantum leap from here, and for that, government has been taking a number of initiatives, starting with the fact that a tax cut, which we never brought in for 25 years in our country, whereas all our competitors had cut their tax rates. Finally, this year, we brought our tax rates from 35 to 25 for existing companies and to 17 for new companies, which compares very favorably for the rest of the world. Only Singapore is close to us. So big positive for India. Next, for foreign FDI capital also, they have waived the DDT and they are given a lot of tax exemptions, which would make that come more easily. One more reason for the FDI outlook, which is favorable to India, is the fact that the crude price drop means that there's a rupee stability in terms of our current account deficit. The rupee has also already depreciated a lot in 9.6%. So further depreciation is not expected so much. And in fact, this year, calendar year to date, Indian currency is in the middle of the pack. If you compare with the rest of the world, we are neither the worst nor the best. Some have appreciated with the dollar. We are in the middle of the pack. And over the long term, there is something called the interest rate parity principle, which drives currency. And if you see the difference in the 10-year US interest rate and 10-year Indian interest rates, generally is the rate of the rupee depreciation. It's hovering around 5%. Our long-term depreciation is 5%. And so we are at par in terms of the value of the rupee, right? Added to this, a strength is that $500 billion is RBI's forex reserves, which helps it to fight any currency instability. And the fact that the FDI flows are expected to rise means further dollar comes in, rupee will be continue to be fairly stable. In addition to this, the government has done a lot of infrastructure work, and because of which our ease of doing business ranking has improved sharply by 79 ranks over the last 5 years, positive for FDI to come in. In addition to this, there are structural positives for India when compared to China. What is that? China's labor supply from the year 2017 has started declining. Why is it declining? One family, one child policy they implemented many years ago. As a result of that, they are going to lose 21 million people from 2017 in the next 10 years, whereas India is going to add 150 million. So clearly labor supply is an advantage. Longevity of labor supply, because India's reduction of labor supply will start from the year 2050. So 30 years, we have a continuous increase in labor supply. The third is that we have, thanks to our English-based education system, our engineering colleges, and our pharmacy colleges, we are well equipped in basic skills, moderate skills, and advanced skills in terms of number of available people to work for any foreign manufacturer to come in. Plus, the cost of labor in India, and with a per capita income at $2,000 compared to $10,000 of China, we are at 1/5 the labor cost. So we are well positioned from a cost competitiveness perspective. Thus, India has become among the most attractive countries for foreign investment in infrastructure and manufacturing. And if you add the financial attractiveness from the tax cuts, the people skills and availability, and the ease of doing business ranking, we are actually ranking ahead of many other countries, including China, at this point from an attractiveness, right? And what's not is that the COVID crisis just enhanced the China opportunity. Because of COVID, the intention to relocate, 44% say that it has increased their intention to locate out of China. Another urgency for moving out within 3 to 6 months has jumped up because of the COVID crisis. People also say that I want to completely shift my factory and not just a part. So the quantitatively, they want to shift a lot, and they want to build new factories in the new country. New capacity creation is a priority. So COVID has helped this cause of India in a big way. Unfortunately, at the present moment, however, we are still behind in the race. Vietnam is the aheadest. So if you look at the total 450 billion that is estimated to move out of China, close to 140 billion, 1/3, Vietnam is ideally positioned to track. India is way behind, but still in second rank at 69 billion. If India has to take over Thailand, Vietnam, and go to the first place, what do we need to do? We need to kickstart the Make in India and the CapEx cycle. That's an imperative to capitalize on this opportunity. And what's involved in that is a whole bunch of things around this circle. Factors most related to relocation decisions. And what are the most important? Low labor costs, that's in our hand. Land costs, land reforms needs to be done by the government as and when they get their parliamentary majority in the Rajya Sabha also, and a reduced tariff trade war risk, which is reasonably okay because of the fact that with the US and with India, it's not as bad as with China and the US. But there are other key factors like policy support, better infrastructure, supply chain, which we still need to work on. Returning to growth for India, we believe over the medium term is only a matter of time, and we think that starting from financial year 22 itself, we should be in a position to bounce to double-digit growth, partly because of the YOY effect, right? So on that note, I'd like to end my presentation with the view that from a longer-term perspective, return to India's GDP growth from an economy perspective is only a matter of time, and hence, in the next webinar, we will take this discussion forward on the terms of what this short-term outlook of the world, the short-term outlook, economic outlook of India, and the medium-term outlook for India means for the stock markets and your investments. Thank you very much for listening, and stay home and stay safe in this time of COVID. All the very best to you.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.